Okay, hi, welcome back. It's me, Devraj, and this is Mysticism in the Body. If you're watching this somewhere other than my channel on YouTube, if you look for Mysticism in the Body and Devraj on YouTube, you'll find me if you want to subscribe. A little bit hungover today. Went out to watch Arsenal in a pub in Kadıköy, Istanbul, where I live. They lost, and I'm not a big Arsenal fan, but some family members are, so I thought I'd show willing. Anyway, I want to do this video about the great magical agent, also known by this chap, Eliphas Levi, very influential character in the kind of late Victorian explosion of interest in magic in Northern Europe and especially London. Though he himself, as you can no doubt divine, was French. His dogma et rituel of high magic. And he spoke quite a bit about the great magical agent, which he also called the Astral Light. And I guess the easiest way to explain the great magical agent is a bit like if you imagine sort of, Harry Potter kind of magic, proper kind of magic from the movies, where you're kind of either, getting something to appear out of thin air, or you're kind of making something happen in the world around you. Maybe there's someone you massively fancy who works in the coffee shop, but they give you zero interest whatsoever, and you think, I could do some spell and they'll fall hopelessly in love with me. Or maybe you just need, you feel like you just need a ton of cash, and you could do some kind of ritual or spell and get some kind of, demon, agent, angel or something to just somehow, let you win the lottery or something like that. And the idea with a great magical agent, it's basically if you've got the great magical agent, then you can direct it in certain ways to get these kind of outcomes to happen. That's the basic concept here. So you might be thinking, well, okay, cool, I'll just get the great magical agent and all will be good. But of course, as these things are, it's really not that simple. As is common in sort of mystical texts, even from like a relatively short period of time ago, like 100, 150 years, or even, 50 years ago, people don't really say what it is because the knowledge is, it was understood that you had to have a lot of secrecy, and that the knowledge was kind of dangerous, that if everyone knew about it, then, all sorts of bad stuff would happen, which possibly is true. And so what tended to happen was they either used these kind of blinds, as they called them, like shifting the numbers of tarot keys around or whatever, or the Sephiroth on the tree of life. Or they used very enigmatic language, You think they're talking about one thing, but they're really talking about something else. And so these kind of alchemists in the Middle Ages, or right up to the time of Eliphas Levi and then the Golden Dawn, there was a lot of this going on. They're using these words, but they're just mundane words that you could use if you wanted to discuss with other people who are in the same scene, but you didn't want outsiders finding about it, and particularly if you wanted to write stuff down. Because you write something down, obviously, it gets printed, and then anyone could buy that book and whatever. I myself don't need to do this for the simple reason that I just kind of talk offhand and from this kind of post-punk background. So, I give everyone any excuse to just utterly disregard what I say as the ramblings of obviously, an idiot who has no clue what he's talking about. Most people, we're bombarded with information, but even before we were bombarded with information, what they do is this kind of heuristic, where you need to rapidly assess, but from someone's manner, the way they're speaking, or the way they're writing, or their background, and do they have letters after their name? Have they written books? You need to rapidly assess if they know what they're talking about or not. So, people like me can just make use of that and just seem like a complete nobody idiot and just jabber away. And someone who's perhaps got a bit of a magnet of the wise, which is, it's that facility where you can spot where something is valuable, even though it's surrounded by all sorts of stuff, or being written by someone who just looks like some kind of idiot. You can spot value in it. Anyway, let me not drone on too much about this. Let's get back to the great magical agent. And the idea with it is that it's everywhere. Basically, it's everywhere. And of course, that's not a particularly helpful explanation of how to find it. but it's diffused, throughout the universe, throughout the body. Everywhere is the astral light, the great magical agent. It's all over the place. But the trick is learning to concentrate it and get it and direct it in a certain fashion. So what really is the astral light, the great magical agent? Well, I think, one way to kind of place it, to get a handle on it a bit, is to place it in the context of the kind of philosophy of Europe at that time. This book was written in the 1860s, I believe, or thereabout. And that's a time when continental philosophy was very dominant. And so, one of the things that's really central to many kind of classic old continental philosophers, from Schopenhauer, Hegel, Nietzsche's will to power, Freud's libido, later on Wilhelm Reich's orgone, there was a lot of discussion in intellectual circles about these things, up until the Nazis, basically, and Heidegger, where essentially this whole idea that there's an innate energy to human life or to the human body, it got marginalized. It got shoved away, lest we create the Nazis again. Basically, that was the concept in Europe at the time. And what happened was kind of more British or American philosophy took over, and that was very against energy. That it was a very scientific a very scientific routine, and if you couldn't, you didn't have an instrument to measure something, then it got marginalized as some kind of pseudoscience, wishy-washy nonsense that weak-minded people might believe in or something. And so this is essentially what happened to energy, and that's why a side of energy is kind of joules, and kinetic energy and that kind of thing. The idea of an intrinsic energy to life or an intrinsic energy in the body, it got progressively marginalized. And yet this essentially is what the astral light is about, a kind of intrinsic energy that you can get from somewhere. You can kind of unbind it from your body for a start. Your body is full of astral light energy. It's full of a great magical agent, I would say. But most of it's bound up inside the muscles and the body fascia. It's similar to Wilhelm Reich, who was a student of Freud back in the 1920s and 30s. His concept of orgone, a kind of universal energy. Freud himself had this notion of libido that some people, he made it much more physical, and you were allowed to do that in psychology. It wasn't like physics or chemistry or something like that. He had this concept of libido, eros, life drive, this kind of thing. And you do meet people who've got a bit more energy than others, on a subjective kind of psychological level. It's obviously true, I think. And so what we're really talking about here is doing stuff to get yourself so that you can get your hands on the great magical agent and start to direct it. And something to understand here, it's like, I made a video the other day about subjectivity and how we learn to, what is me and what is not me. And then this kind of becomes a very hard boundary. So for some people, they would say, well, I could accept energy in your body, but not energy in the world. But actually, it's only the primal acts of identification, of learning what is me and what is not me, that comes in from the cultural conditioning that we're brought up in around the age of 1 or whatever, that creates these designations. So it's actually, if you start to rip some of that conditioning out, it's actually not so hard to imagine that there's a universal energy that's connecting, that's inside your body just as much as it's in the world, because you're only seeing your world and indeed the body through the senses anyway. So actually what I'm saying here is that when you start to dissolve a little bit this early, 1-year-old conditioning that came from the culture, you realise that the idea that there might be energy in the world as well as in the body is really not so radical as it would seem when you're very locked up inside this perspective. And indeed, just to expand a little bit from that at all, if you want to understand and be able to do anything with esoteric stuff, that's that primary partitioning of the mind that went on during the Piscean era and the Piscean cultures. That's the thing that's hiding all of this stuff. That's the thing that's making it all look totally mad and weird. This primal rendering of the psyche as dual that goes on in our early childhood, that's what hides all this stuff. That's what makes it look all weird and also very hard to find. Anyway, to get back specifically to the great magical agent, the astral light, How I see the astral light, and I'm just starting to get into this stuff, and the great magical agent, is that it is closely related to the kind of libidinal vitality that a person experiences, and that they can send up by unbinding energy from where it's been bound up in the muscles and the fascia through, cultural conditioning and a bit of trauma or whatever. By doing certain breathwork processes, which were also quite dominant in 20th century occultism, or some bioenergetic kind of exercises with your body, you can get more energy moving. And then once you've got the energy and you can kind of feel the energy inside the sensation of the body, then you can start to direct it. And in a sense, this process is represented by probably what is Levi's most famous picture, the picture that he's famous for, which is that of Baphomet, somewhat controversial kind of character from mythology. And he's a kind of human goat-like character here. And if you look closely on his arms, is Solve, and on this side it says Coagula. And there's a kind of light moon here and a dark moon here. And, he's got his horns, and he's also got this kind of flare, light flare. I mean, it's a black and white picture that's coming out of his head, What this picture is essentially saying, Solve is being able to break down existing forms to get the energy from them. Dissolving, then Coagula, down here, is getting that energy and putting it into a new form. A form which you access via your own imaginal capacity, via your own inner eye. So Baphomet is actually a symbol for the astral light, the great magical agent. And so essentially he represents the process by which forms change, by which old forms kind of disappear and which new forms come along according to the imagination of man. And this flare on his head, I think, is very similar to the Rosicrucian concept of an inner sun, that through certain meditative practices, you can also get sunlight and energy to flow in your body, flow in your bloodstream, and create a kind of inner illumination. And one of the aspects or side effects of this illumination is that it makes it easier to visualize things in your kind of inner eye, whether your eyes are closed or not, in your mind's eye, so to speak. And then you can visualize things and give them energy and kind of try to create them in the world around you. So that's what's going on here in his left arm, pointing downwards. I'll make another video as well, at least one more, about the astral light and the great magical agent, and pick up some more of Levi's and Paul Foster Case's kind of concepts about it. And we can also look, why Baphomet is traditionally regarded as a pretty negative sort of character. Like here in Builders of the Esoteric Tarot, you see pretty much the same guy, but he's got an inverse pentagram, which you've watched kind of, old Hammer horror movies, is terrible. And is his hands looking a bit different here? This hand's holding a rather feeble torch, but it's essentially the same character. So in another video I'll pick up this stuff, there's two people chained to this guy. But this is just a little bit of an intro to the great magical agent, which is something I myself am only learning about. So I hope you found it interesting, and do feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you back shortly for some more mysticism and the body. Thank you very much.